Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's Billy Bob here. I have a special guest that I would like to introduce to everyone. This is Mr. Tim Moen. I think, from my understanding, his greatest claim to fame is being the leader of the Libertarian Party in Canada for several years.
Yeah.
Is that accurate, Tim?
That's probably, yes, that's probably my biggest claim to fame, I guess, unfortunately. I ran for prime minister in 2015 and popularized the slogan, I want gay married couples to be able to protect their marijuana plants with guns. And that's kind of what put me on the political map and gave me 15 minutes of fame, so to speak. But I carried on leading the party for a number of years after that, you bet.
I definitely undersold you then. That's an awesome claim to fame. You want the gay people to protect their plants with guns. That's awesome. Yeah. So yeah, I'm sorry for underselling you, but tremendous guest we have today. And I reached out to Tim about a week ago or so, and I really wanted to engage with him on his ideas because as a communist myself, and he's a libertarian, I think there's a lot of room for greater understanding between our two ideologies, and I think at the core, we're very similar. Like we're very similar people, and there's not really a lot of differences, but we're kind of divided by these ideological frameworks. And so this is an exercise in trying to work through that, understanding each other and coming to some common ground and agreement on moving forward, as a society, even though, we're technically in different countries because I'm in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, for me, just from my perspective, I'm very interested in this conversation because, it comes down to peaceful coexistence, right? Like, even if we can't persuade each other towards our point of view in the world, is there a way, can we model a way even to peacefully coexist, even if we vehemently disagree at the end of the day about how society ought to be structured or, some ethical questions? Can we at least peacefully coexist? And this conversation, I think, will be instructive in trying to muddle our way through that, because I'm sure we're going to, we should let the audience know, we've already had one conversation on my channel. I haven't published it yet. I hope to publish it today. It should be up. But there are some things you talked about it as I questioned you, trying to explore and understand that triggered me. Okay. And so it would have been very easy for me to allow that emotional trigger to ruin the conversation, to just derail it. And so we're kind of trying to muddle our way through, how do we have a conversation with people we might vehemently disagree with a lot of things on and still remain civil and still peacefully coexist. And that's what interests me is can I develop some type of formula or principles here that can be applicable going forward in having conversations with people? Because I don't know if you've noticed, Billy Bob, or your audience has noticed, but it seems like society is getting more and more polarized, and we're all getting siloed off into our own kind of ideological or tribal bubbles. And that doesn't seem like it's a good thing. It seems like it's a recipe for violence and conflict and all sorts of things that I'd like to think we both want to avoid.
I agree with that observation, and as a communist, it kind of affirms my own worldview when you describe things like that, because to me, it's the overt intentionality of dividing and conquering, the working class, and to siloing everybody in this little group where they're not connected, they're not unifying, and they're not coming together, as a political force to upset the ruling establishment. So, right. I mean, I don't think that's by accident, right? That's not just happening for no reason. It's by design. I mean,
yeah,
that's what I would say.
Probably right.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, I did want to maybe just open up, because you mentioned right before the show that you did a long article, 6,000 words. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And it just got published recently. So I want to discuss that, and that could be like an opening up into you're trying to explain to a filthy communist like myself, why we ought to embrace, a more libertarian, ideology.
Sure. Well, I mean, I could certainly send a link to the article. I mean, it's pretty inside baseball. It's applicable to Albertans. I wrote it for an Albertan audience because it deals with very specific details about our specific context and our health system and different things like that. But it might give you some insight into my thinking. But maybe a good place to start is how I became a libertarian, my come to Jesus moment, so to speak. It was a very unsettled time in my life. I was going through a divorce as a kind of evangelical Christian. I knew that would sentence me to hell for eternity, and I was looking for a way out. And so I started reading a lot of alternative, I guess, religious viewpoints. Is there a way I could? Maybe I was looking at the Bible wrong. Maybe I won't go to hell. So I started investigating a lot of authors. There was this one Anglican minister called John Shelby Spong, who wrote a book called The Sins of Scripture, who kind of wrote about some of the contradictions and some of the, how we ought not to take this thing as like a literal black and white text, but more as a metaphor that gives us some guiding principles. And, that gave me some relief, but it opened up my mind to, okay, I'm now escaping this dogma. And I at one point I had a realization that had I been born in another part of the world, my belief system would be totally different. I like to think I'm a smart guy and that I arrived at my beliefs through reason and logic and evidence. But no, almost everything I believed had been put there by my environment, by my culture, by my family, by my community, by my government. And so that was, that's an obvious point. I mean, I think most people, if they gave thought for a minute about it, would realize the same thing. But it was very unsettling to me that I had no part in what I believed in my brain and the way I viewed the world and the way I then behaved in the world. And so that just sent me on a rabbit hole of thought, of examining all the beliefs that were wrong in my head that might've been harmful. Right. And I believe that my evangelical Christianity had caused some harm, and it had caused some harm to other people. I remember as a camp counselor, having dealing with little kids who I genuinely thought were going to go to hell because they weren't believers, and explaining to them how they were going to suffer an eternal torment. And I look back at, it makes my skin crawl today to think of the things I did in the name of a belief that I had, that I in good faith accepted wholeheartedly. And so it made me realize how important my having the right beliefs in my head were into how I show up in the world. So I had to basically re-examine everything. And of course, one of those things I re-examined was my belief in government and how that, where that came from. And so I got very involved in the skeptic community and, just how do I know if my belief is true or not? And so libertarianism to me is more of an attitudinal disposition of skepticism towards extraordinary moral claims. And, those extraordinary moral claims are that we need an institution that uses violence and implements violence in order to have a peaceful world. And that these people, by virtue of winning a popularity contest, have rights that you or I don't have to take without consent, to lock in a cage, to tell us what we can and can't put into our own bodies, to tell us what we can and can't trade on a market. In Canada, I can't have lawn darts. I can't have a baby walker. I can't have certain types of light bulb that I might want. All these things, where do they get this right? And so I have a disposition of skepticism towards those people's claim to control my life. And so that's kind of where libertarianism came from for me. So I don't, I think in our last conversation, we talked a little bit about rights, and you correctly pointed out, I believe, that this idea of universal human rights is a bad one. And because I talked about, getting at deeper principles that are universal, and you rightly pointed out, well, this, because these rights aren't things. They aren't, if I have a right to healthcare, we say I have a right to healthcare, and then I say, well, Billy Bob, you're a healthcare worker, you have to provide me healthcare, or you have to pay for my healthcare. Well, my right to healthcare now infringes on your right, so it's not coherent. So to me, it's like an attitudinal disposition of skepticism towards this. And when you whittle away all these extraordinary claims, what you're left with is essentially what I would describe as libertarianism, which is I don't have the right to impose my will on you. I have, and that's about it. So I don't know if you have any more questions about that, but.
No, so, again, like I think last discussion, I kind of was trying to do my best to explain where I'm coming from
Sure.
a little bit, and it took you some time to process. So I'm trying to do the same thing, with your defense, your apology of, apologetics of, where you're at and how you got there and why you're there. And I'm just, it doesn't come, it's the first time I'm hearing it. So I'm trying to think of,
well, maybe I can explain a little bit more what's sort of emerges from that. Okay. And if I could whittle libertarianism down to basically two ideas. One is the non-aggression principle, one which says I don't have the right. It talks about when is it legitimate to use violence. Okay. And I say I have the right to use violence only to defend myself. I don't have a right to use violence to impose my will on you. And also coupled with that would be property rights. Property rights are those things that I own, that I can rightfully say are mine. It starts with my body. I have a claim over this body. No one else can be said to have a claim over this body. This kidney is mine. You don't have a right to take it, even if it's goes into a pool. Even if the government says everyone has to donate one kidney to the kidney pool so that no one who has kidney failure needs to die, well, I still assert that they don't have the right to remove that kidney from my body against my will. That's my kidney, belongs to me. And I have a right to that which I appropriate that is unowned in a state of nature. So if I go out into the wilderness and cut down some trees, build myself a cabin, no one else can be said to own that cabin but me. Well, I can also get property or give property to someone else. I can give that cabin to you, Billy Bob, and say that's yours now. I've transferred ownership to you. We can make an agreement, write up a contract, whatever, to prove that agreement exists, and now that cabin is yours. So that is essentially it. So it's, you don't, no one else has a right to take that cabin from you or steamroll you, and you have a right to defend that cabin as a corollary. Like if someone is trying to take it from you, you can use as much force as is necessary to protect what's yours. And so that's essentially, I think, libertarianism in a nutshell.
So let me ask you this. So, I mean, I see rights as, again, I don't see any kind of natural thing. Like, so the natural condition of man is like the law of the jungle, right? If you abstract us from society, there are no rights. I mean, it's just might makes right. I mean, that's kind of how, in the outside of society, before, you have any kind of, organizational laws or systems of taxation and government and law enforcement. It's just might makes right. And so that's kind of the natural, starting
Sure.
point for humanity.
Yeah.
So from that point, nobody has any rights under that situation. Now we make the distinction between your political rights and maybe a moral right. So if there's no
Yeah.
society, we're just all
I don't make that distinction as a libertarian. I don't make that distinction.
okay. So um, outside of society, we're all just Neanderthals, and the strongest Neanderthal gets to do what he wants with impunity, and the weakest one is just, has to live in, oppression or whatever.
Mhm.
So, I mean, you can make an argument that that's not morally correct, but politically, that's the way it is because there's no other better system that people are living under. So it might not be
Right.
morally correct, but it's just the way it is due to the lack
Yeah.
of systems, you could say. So and then so we think we can do better. Humans are smart. We get together. Hey, we can have a better kind of a system. And so when I talk about rights, like I don't think there's anything as a universal, natural right. I
Yeah.
mean, rights are
Well,
those things.
you don't have the right. Let's say if we value if we value life and peace, then we can't say that you have a right to use force, right? So, well, I guess what I'm saying is, like libertarianism to me is the opposite of rights. It's like you don't have the right? So you don't have the right to do that. You can't claim that to be moral if you're using might to get your way in the world. That might be what happens in nature. That might be what happens if we're living it without any thought to peace or coexistence. But you can't claim that's moral. You can't claim that right is moral. That's an extraordinary claim, and that is the claim that is made constantly by those advocating, government and that sort of thing. So it's more about, quite often, yes, I use the term rights as a kind of shorthand, but really what I mean is you don't have the right. Most of the things that are advocated in the world, people don't have the right to do.
And my the way I conceive of rights again is that rights come from community and they come from society, and as a collective we kind of determine what rights we are going to lend to each other, and we kind of determine that, hey, we're going to have a form of government, and we're going to give that government special rights because we see that government is a necessary tool of law enforcement and maintaining a system to ensure that we don't revert back to might makes right. And so to me, rights are just what we as a society agree upon, and they can be different from society to society. But I'm not
and by the way, that's there are a lot of libertarians, I would say, that agree with that to some extent, right? Like they would agree with me that you don't have the right to initiate violence, but you do have the right to defensive force. And so because you have that right, you can then delegate that to a government and outsource that right to a government to use force on your behalf to protect you, to protect your property, to protect your body, and that sort of thing. I am an anarchist, so I think that is a contradiction in term, because the government is an institution that has rights that you or I don't have, so we can't properly delegate rights we don't have to a government. The government is a monopoly on force. I can't start a monopoly on force. I don't have that right. I can't use violence to stop you from from basically taxing you and doing that sort of thing. That would be called, most people would rightfully call that violent extortion or armed robbery or something like that, if I were to tax someone. So where does the government get that right from? If I don't have that right, if none of the people around me have that right, how does the government get that right? And so I think the idea of government is contradiction of libertarian principles. Not all libertarians agree with me. Objectivists and minarchists, for example, would say that government can be limited. If we can just limit government to using defensive force to protect the individual, then that's a legitimate government. But I think by its very nature, it violates the individual and violates rights and uses rights that we can't properly delegate it because we don't have those rights.
So in your opinion, there's certain inalienable rights, and the right to one's property and bodily autonomy, and the right not to have their rights violated by others.
I would put it another way, Billy Bob. There's you have certain non-rights, okay? And those non-rights include you don't use force against other people. You don't take their stuff. You don't violate their property. So it's some people call them negative rights because, you have a right to be left alone, essentially, but you don't have a right to positive obligations or something like that. That might be one way of putting it, but I think that's even a little clunky. I think a more accurate word is you don't have the right to use force against people and take their stuff and impose your will on them. You don't have rights.
But in lieu of a kind of system that makes that criminalized and enforces the law against that, how do you keep that from happening?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I don't have the answer. I mean, it's a little bit like asking, okay, if we don't have slavery, how is cotton going to get picked, right? And abolitionists in the 1800s and before, who were arguing against slavery as immoral, would have to answer questions from people who accepted a moral, truth that slavery is just part of nature, part of the natural order, part of how our system runs. How is it going to run without slavery? Well, I mean, if an abolitionist back then said, well, in the future, like there's going to be mechanized harvesters that basically harvest this cotton and spit t-shirts out the back or something, they would have been laughed at and said, well, you can't prove that, therefore, right? So I'm not making the argument from pragmatism here that, if I were an abolitionist, I couldn't argue that that there's a better system for harvesting cotton that doesn't involve slaves, because I don't know what that system is. All I can say is slavery is immoral and ought to be abolished. And if cotton doesn't get picked, well, I guess so be it. But I have some ideas about how that can happen. Certainly it was, reading some anarchist philosophers that made me kind of see how, because that was my sticking point too, was, okay, well, we need government or else everything's going to fall apart. How are things like law and order and law enforcement and criminals, how are they going to be dealt with without government? And so it was reading some philosophers who outlined some different schemes about how it could happen that made me kind of get past that. So I mean, if you want to hear some ideas about how it might happen in a libertarian or free society, I'm happy to share those with you. But at the end of the day, my core criticism of the system is ethical, moral, and I guess you could say deontological, in that, look, you don't have the right to use force, even if you claim cotton won't get picked without it.
So, and before I continue to try and pick away at what you're saying, let me just take a second to appreciate, what you're saying and where it's coming from, because to me, like, that's perfectly legit. Like, it's perfectly understandable and rational to suggest that people shouldn't, aggress against other people, or violate, their rights to their property or their bodily autonomy. Like, that's a no-brainer that everybody ought to be able to support and get behind.
Yeah. Oh, good. I'm glad you agree.
And I'm not sure anybody really, seriously argues otherwise, But I think the question it becomes, I mean, that's the perfect world when everybody behaves appropriately and everybody treats everybody like they want to be treated.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, that's kind of not how life works. And
Right.
especially if you're going to be in a society that is so massively disproportionate with, wealth and power disparities, it's even more difficult just to make everybody, regardless of their socioeconomic status, to behave appropriately. And so,
Yeah.
to me, it kind of turns into, utopianism. It's great idealism, but I'm not sure what relevance it has to actually changing things for the better. Like how do we take this ideal and utilize it to change and progress society to a better situation than we have right now, than the current status quo. And I think we share a lot of complaints about how the current status quo operates and the problems with it. I think we might have some disagreements too, but
yeah. Well, let me just say something about that. I don't view libertarianism as utopianism. There's certainly going to be crime. There's certainly going to be all these problems. There's going to be social problems. I mean, there could be people starving, although I think there'd probably be a lot more abundance. But there's going to be issues to deal with for sure. And I view it as the opposite of utopianism in a lot of ways, because the claims I get on the other side are we need this government policy, or people are going to starve, or a pandemic's going to kill us, or some terrorists are going to destroy our whatever the claim is. We just need a little bit more statism, a little bit more government, and then things will be better. Things will be well. I make the opposite claim that no, things will be worse. The more we use violence to solve problems, especially complex social problems, the further away we get from an actual solution, the more chaos we create. And so, to me, what's working, what's actually holding society together right now is anarchy. It's all the voluntary interactions that people freely choose in, despite all the structural oligopoly, ruling elite constraints that are placed on us, that actually keep society going. So it's anarchy that is the only thing that's working in society right now, despite all the government and the statism and the violence and aggression that's imposed on people.
Earlier in the discussion, I made the assertion that in lieu of some kind of a system of laws, law enforcement, and government, people will revert back to might makes right and the law of the jungle. So,
yeah.
If we conceive of this system as being imperfect, and we're saying we need to get rid of the system because the system's the problem, to me, it just that seems like it's a regression, and we'd be reverting right back to a might makes right system that may or may not have existed before humanity tried to hey, we can build a better system, and we can have protections, and we can have some rights, and we can do better than might makes right.
Yeah.
But when I hear what I just heard from you was, no, we need to whittle the system down, make it as small as possible, and then destroy it if possible, and that's going to improve things.
Well, it depends what you mean by the system, I suppose. Okay. If you think the system is might makes right, then what we need is, I'm saying we need to get rid of the might makes right system, because that's what we have right now. I mean, we have might makes right. I mean, the people with all the power and the guns and the ability to wield violence are the ones that control things. So we have might makes right now. And what I'm saying is we ought to try to move away from that. Now, does that mean that, like, if I had magic powers, that I believe if snapping my fingers and getting rid of all these institutions, police, government, courts, that things would be wonderful? And things, no, I think we would have gang warfare. We would essentially have government would reemerge, right? We would create a power vacuum and government would reemerge. And so I believe, and I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but in order to get to this system, it requires convincing enough people, a tipping point of people that might doesn't make right, and that we ought to find voluntary ways of organizing ourselves. And maybe that involves, and one of the ideas I've been exploring lately, I'm just in the middle of reading this book that's got my brain lit up on fire. It's called The Network State. And it's by an author that talks about how, because there have been libertarian projects that have tried to basically create parallel societies or parallel communities or even nations that are kind of outside the system, but don't like attack the system, right? Because a lot of what me and my compatriots have done is attack, right? And that's what I was doing as Libertarian Party leader. You could argue is that what I needed to do was grasp the ring of power and then take it to Mordor and throw it in the lava or whatever. But actually, what I was trying to do was just educate people, because to me, until you have a tipping point of people that accept this philosophy or this way of being, we're not going to solve the problem by simply firing all the politicians and burning parliament and banning all these institutions. There has to be people and then you have to build the kind of organization you want based on these principles, right? And so a lot of libertarians have tried this. There's a project called Seasteading that Patry Friedman, who's Milton Friedman's grandson, has spearheaded, which is like creating micronations out at sea in international water, which is, kind of the last territory that hasn't been expropriated by might makes right people, and create essentially voluntary government. So you plant a seastead, and other people can take their property, their floating platforms up to your seastead, create communities based on a rule set that you as the founder have kind of created. And so there's rules there, and there's enforcement of those rules, so it looks very similar to a government. But, at the end of the day, if you can't follow the rules, well, you're banned, right? You take your property and leave, right? Like float away, go to another seastead that follows whose rule set you find more amenable or whatever. So you kind of create a market of governments, but they're voluntary governments. So that I don't, whether you can call them governments, I think they're very different types of organizations than what we call government today. But what this author is talking about is network states. And he's saying that territorial, because we have networks and we have technology like blockchain and cryptocurrencies, we can now create network states or nations. There can be a founder, can set up a rule set. You can have this one big idea. Maybe you could call it liberty or something like that. Or, there's a bunch of these that he's tracking. There's one that's all about van life, right? So it's all these people who live kind of vagabond lives on the road, who are banding together to create a network. And eventually, he describes 7 stages that you go through, with the final, at some point you crowdsource territory, and you can get like archipelagos, and they can be all over the world within nations. But you have a census on a blockchain, and eventually, if you get enough people and do enough lobbying, you could get diplomatic recognition, right? You could be recognized as a nation of a sort, and wield some power politically, to primarily be left alone, would be the idea that you don't, and so one could imagine, for example, a nation of people that are opposed to pandemic rules or like the COVID-19 mandates, and they band together and use their collective resources to protect the individuals in that nation from the states that are trying to impose certain mandates or rules on them, or prosecute them, or do different things. Maybe you could crowdsource legal, all these different things. So to me, that's what's more exciting. That's a more probably pragmatic way of getting to the future I want, which is to make might is right irrelevant or less attractive to people, and say, look, here's how organizing voluntarily around an idea with a basic rule set of don't impose your will or force on others, how that might be more attractive in the long run and make might is right governments obsolete. And I believe that in 200 years from now, we'll be looking at the system of government we have now with the same moral repulsion that we currently look at slavery or human sacrifice or something like that, even though societies at those times just saw it as the norm. And how could we operate without these things? I think in the future, we'll be looking back at the way we organize now and kind of being, oh, those are the dark ages.
So that's interesting. You know, I am not that familiar other than what you just explained about the different ideas of, you know, putting into practice, pragmatically putting into practice, you know, the doctrine. And I probably ought to, you know, study that a little bit more to familiarize myself, to have a better appreciation. I mean, I've heard that, you know, some communities, they have tried and they didn't work out so well.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, my knowledge is very limited, so that's definitely an area where I can learn more. We talked about might makes right, and so my point would be that there's degrees, right? There's degrees of might makes right, and there's you know, and that's with everything. I think you know, before we were conceptualizing humanity, you know, in stages, and before any kind of systems or any kind of structures, humans were just, you know, not in a community, and it was just whoever's strong takes over. And then, you know, people decided, you know, there's got to be a better way. And then we went through like feudalism, where kings and lords would protect the serfs, but the serfs would have to give them, you know, service and
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. And then that gave way to an improved system, which is definitely capitalism, and capitalism is definitely a big improvement over feudalism and slavery. But there's still, you know, like you said, today, I mean, might makes right is still a principle that definitely manifests itself in our society, but it's not to the degree that it used to be, right? And so we're seeing progression.
Yeah, no,
and then
that's probably true. I mean, I you know, I wonder about that. I mean, I don't know if you've ever looked at, there's a professor from Hawaii. He has a chart on democide, right? Which are governments killing their own people. And I mean, the numbers are shocking and off the charts. And, you know, that's still going on today. I think Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he talks about how violence in general has gone down. I'll accept that. And I'll even accept that, that the state, that things are moving in a generally better direction. Like, it might be better to have a government in place that monopolizes violence and does it in a predictable way, than to have kind of the random violence that occurs by just warring tribes and gangs absent a government, right? And so I could concede that point, that that's better than what came before it. But
and a warring tribe and a warring gang, those are kinds of governments. Like, they
yes,
have their own
yeah, exactly,
governments. So,
right.
So these are all systems, and I think what kind of perplexes me when I listen to libertarians, it's this idea that the system is the problem, you know, and they want to abolish the system. But again, if you abolish the system, you know, you just revert back to an individual level of violence, and people will quickly, like you said earlier, people will quickly create something very similar to government to, you know, protect themselves, have their basic needs met, have their, you know, mental security as well as physical security. And so I just don't see systems as the problem. Like, fundamentally, I see systems as necessary. And my question is, what system is going to work better or work best, or work better? Because I don't, you know, there's no such thing as perfection. We're not going to attain perfection. It's not going to happen. but I see a lot of, you know, I think that, you know, a lot of times libertarians are pursuing perfection, and I understand that, but
Yeah.
then it's not pragmatic, it's not realistic.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Do you, let me ask you this, Billy Bob. Do you think that communists are also accused of the same thing? You know, because quite often, I mean, you sent me um, a kind of write-up that you did, and one of the things is in there is that communists are utopians, that they're looking for like a cashless, borderless, classless utopia kind of thing, right? And so, do you think that it's an unfair accusation to say that communists are utopians and that they're looking to abolish the system as well in favor of a different system or something?
I think that's definitely fair. I think I think the end stage of you know, communism as described by Marx, one could probably correctly categorize that as utopian. A lot of people are going to be angry at me for saying that, because utopianism was a specific thing that Marx actually denounced during his time. But when we talk about, you know, a global society of abundance that is, you know, borderless, cashless, and, you know, the workers own the means of production, to get to that, it just seems like, I mean, that's why that's such a fantastic jump into the future. One could say that's utopian, because I don't see that happening, you know, for hundreds of years, and you're gonna have generations of de-indoctrination and you know, also, you know, creation of abundance before we get there. So it's tough to say that's utopian or not utopian. I mean,
Right.
I'm not going to attack you if you want to call it utopian.
Well,
But again,
I mean, I'm just pointing out that,
yeah,
you know, the perception of your philosophy is similar to the perception of my philosophy, right? And
yeah.
whether that's accurate or not, I don't believe it's accurate about libertarianism, although I could see where it comes from. I could certainly see that, you know, that because the way libertarians act, right, and talk, it is always about, and that's, you know, and actually that's how anarchists like me often get criticized by minarchists by saying, well, if you get rid of government, it'll just be warring gangs. And that's a fair criticism. Yeah, if you get rid of government, we'll probably have just another government emerge. You know, but my retort to that is, well, yeah, I mean, if the worst case scenario is what we have now, then what does that say about what we have now? That's pretty bad, isn't it? But look, I'm one of these guys that is happy with incremental improvements, and even if I get to some future state where it's what I would describe as an anarchist society, where people aren't using might makes right, they aren't initiating violence, they are respecting each other's property rights, they are engaging in voluntary relationships, not coercive, violently coercive ones. That's a society I would describe as anarchist. There's no rulers. There are people cooperating and coexisting and organizing society and taking care of criminals and doing things without initiating violence. But even if we get to that state, I'm probably wired, you know, in my personality to say, this isn't good enough, guys. We could do better. Like, you know, you could imagine one kind of anarchist society where I'm sitting on my front porch and telling a kid, don't step on my grass or I'll blow you away. And one where I'm inviting him in for lemonade, and I would prefer the latter one to the former, even though they might both be described as anarchists. But, and if, you look at the article I just wrote, you know, you pointed out 6,000 words, you know, I'm generally optimistic about the very marginal improvement that our premier is making in our healthcare system. I'm applauding it. I'm encouraging it, not because it's in any way libertarian, but because it at least opens the door for a guy like me to have more freedom in my healthcare practice. And so, yeah. I mean, I don't know if that helps explain things a little bit, but I'm not looking to simply tear down the system. At least I don't think I am. But I am looking to move us away from that towards more voluntary systems. I think in the same way you're looking to move the current system away from where we're at to something that would closer approximate your ideal world.
Yeah. If we're going to go back to, my conceptual framework, systems are essential. Systems are necessary.
Yeah.
And I think we agree that if we abolish this system, another system is going to,
I agree with you about systems. I did a graduate degree in leadership, and I look, and it was all about systems analysis, right? There's a system here in my family, and it does me well to evaluate that. I hold a lot of power. In fact, my wedding ring, you probably can't see it, but it's a replica of the Ring of Power from Lord of the Rings, and it's to remind me that my kids didn't choose me. And because of that, I have a duty to really consider the power I have over them and be judicious in how I use it. And again, I apply kind of libertarian philosophy in my household of, I use protective force. I'll stop you from running out onto the road or doing something dangerous, but I won't initiate force. I won't hit you or spank you or confine you to your room, because that violates my principles. And so now I have to look at things very differently. I have to look at myself almost as an entrepreneur and look in the mirror first and think, okay, how can I best provide value to my kids? How can I get them to adulthood in a way that they are fully autonomous, actualized humans that own themselves, that don't require my leadership anymore. And so I have to look at that family system in the same way I have to look at an organizational system and see, okay, is micromanaging my employees the best way to move as an organization, or is there a better way as a leader in an organization to serve them? Can I be a servant leader and provide, because they're the ones that are essentially doing the work of the organization. How can I serve their needs and provide them the resources they need and look after them and put myself in harm's way if necessary for them, because of the fact that I'm a leader? So there's systems everywhere, and I'm not about abolishing systems. I'm about moving towards a more voluntary, ethical system.
So when you describe your ideal system, the fundamental principles that would guide that system were what you mentioned at the beginning of the program, right? It's your rights to your property and your person, and your right to be free from having your rights violated by someone else.
Well, it's more about your obligation not to impose will on others, right? Violate their property, violate their body. And if you remove that from the table as your way of behaving in the world, now you have to show up in a very different way in the system, right? You have to now provide value to people that you're maybe in leadership position over, and that sort of thing, right?
So let me challenge you on that a little bit.
Sure.
Of course, it sounds great, but in practice, if we're a group of people that get together in a society and say, hey, we need to come up with a system and structure that benefits everybody in this society, but we can't just allow people to opt out, because like if we set up a system of rules or a system of taxation sufficient enough to enforce those rules, if we just let somebody opt out, well, they're going to get all the benefit of society, but they're not going to be, contributing. So we're kind of stuck in a conundrum where we're like, if to hear your ideal society, it's like we can't force people to participate, but that really limits what society is going to be capable of achieving. Because without, getting everybody to follow the law, then there's no law, and
Sure.
So we're not advancing, we're not progressing.
Let me outline how I agree with you. Like if you're not contributing to a community, you can't expect to maintain membership and benefit in that community, right? And I think we agree on that. But I also, where I might disagree with you is on your right to exit that community. But what does exiting that community look like is the question, right? So, there might be some like hardcore, like survivalist type libertarians who don't even want to be in a community and just want to be left alone out in the wilderness and maybe come into town to trade or something like that. But then there's others who are more metropolitan, right? They want to be in a city. They want to, and of course, look, if you're not contributing, should you be able to maintain membership in that city? So, some of the things, again, this comes back to systems that are different, arranged on voluntary kind of principles rather than coercive principles, where you're both required to participate and you're not allowed to exit at any point. You might consider, if I were an entrepreneur and I want to build a city, a community, might do what my buddy Gabriel is doing in Saskatchewan right now, where he bought up a bunch of farmland, and his idea is to sell off square feet of these of this farmland to people that want to live in his community. He issues NFTs as title, and you could buy 100 square feet and pitch a tent. You can buy 5,000 square feet and build a mansion, whatever you want. And he'll have a rule set in that community that you explicitly agree to by buying property there. You are agreeing to certain rule sets, right? And so you could imagine if I want to build a community that attracts paying customers that find this community valuable, what are the rule set that I would have? Well, you'd probably have to contribute a certain amount of money a year to the community, a fee to me as the city owner, the infrastructure owner. And in return, I'm going to agree to take away your garbage, provide, fire protection, maintain the roads and the infrastructure of the city. And if I don't do that, then there are consequences to me. Okay, there's a dispute resolution organization or a court that will hold me to my end of the contract, and an unhappy resident can say, you're not fixing the potholes, you're not taking away the garbage, and they'll get immediate access to justice by virtue of us having a voluntary contract that we're agreeing binds us both to this agreement. Likewise, if you don't pay your share of the annual fee, I don't want to call it taxation because it's something you're voluntarily agreeing to. Well, then I have the right to engage in action against you or get compensated or whatever, or maybe take your property and kick you out of the community because you're not contributing to the community. Likewise, if you would agree to follow the rules in that community, and that's like, don't shit on the sidewalks and do what they're doing in San Francisco and put up a tent city or whatever, right? There's going to be certain rules, or we're going to treat you as a trespasser, and we're going to exile you from the community until such time as you submit to the court's ruling of restoring justice, and that's whatever remedy they come up with. So here's a system. Notice it doesn't look horribly different than what we have now in municipalities, but the big difference here is that it's a voluntary arrangement. The city can't arbitrarily do things because we have an explicit contract. I don't have to wait 4 years for a political cycle to go through and hope to get my guy elected so that he can implement the reforms that will make things right in my world. I have immediate access to justice. You're not doing what you agreed to do as the city. So I don't think it looks horrifically different than the communities or the cities we have now. I move to that city, I have to agree to behave a certain way and contribute a certain way because I'm in a community with a bunch of other folks, and there are I guess bilateral enforcement mechanisms to make sure the city behaves and make sure I behave in that agreement in that community or something like that. And that would be something that doesn't violate libertarian principles of might makes right.
my first objection was going to be that's very similar to
Yeah.
existing society. But no, you explained the differences, and I can appreciate that. I mean, it sounds like in your system, the regulatory framework is much better funded and works a lot quicker.
Well,
Than
I mean, if it didn't, I wouldn't subscribe to it, right? I wouldn't put my money. I'd find a community where there was clear access to justice and where those frameworks worked, and I could vote with my feet, so to speak, and my money.
I actually have somebody watching and giving us a question, which I don't know if we want to get off on that.
No, let's engage your audience here. He's been waiting a while.
Okay. You know, it's interesting. Let me just put a final point because I get the last word. That's
yeah, absolutely.
But you know, what's missing, I think, from I hear what you're saying, and what keeps me from wholeheartedly embracing it is that I think there's a huge thing that your perspective is missing, and I think that's the reality of oppositional class interests, and how when you have the means of production owned by private interests, that creates a political and economic division of interests. So people that relate to the means of production as workers who have to sell their labor in order to survive have different political and economic interests than do the owners of those means of production who profit off of the labors of others. So there's this oppositional thing. This leads to a struggle to control the levers of political power. So the owners who have particular economic and political interests struggle to control the system and implement those systems and a kind of system that benefits their interests, whereas the working class, my hands are all over the place.
I get you.
The working class, also has, different political and economic interests, and there's this struggle for political power. So let me answer that and turn it off. And I think, the kind of government we have is very much influenced by the nature of the class that controls it. So in the West, I would argue that we have it's ownership control. It's the wealthy elites that dominate the system and control the system and own every aspect of the system. And they're pretty good at placating us and indoctrinating us and getting us to go along with their agenda. They bribe us, they threaten us, and they get us to really think in ways that are not threatening to this sweet system that's really sweet for them. And they tell us, hey, it could be worse. You could be Haiti. So pat yourselves on the back that the poorest 40% of people, for instance, account for less than 1% of the total wealth. Well, you're still doing better than those people in Haiti. Sure. And so, this is a reality to me. This is the most profound, most important aspect of reality that really informs the kinds of systems that are available, that we have right now, and that might be possible in the future. Is it's really influenced by what class is in charge of the system and in whose interest is the system being run for. So that's a very important component. And so when we talk about when we ignore all of that and we just focus on individual rights and liberty, and we can't aggress against people, I think it's problematic, because I'm not sure it's ever going to be able to come up against the entrenched forces that define the status quo. And I think force isn't the worst. So that's another issue I have. When we talk about principles, it makes sense that using coercive force against somebody isn't bad, but it's not the worst. I can think of a lot more worse things. And often in politics, in reality, you have to choose between two evils. And often aggressing against someone is definitely not even close to being the worst evil. There's a lot more worse things than a little aggression against someone. So that's I mean, that's,
well, look, I there's a lot there that I actually agree with. I don't disagree with the fact
Ursula,
that
we're going to get to you, Ursula.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. We'll get to you. This might be a good place to wrap up. You know, we could end with answering Ursula's question here, but it would be a good launching point for our next discussion when you come back on my channel on the Tim Moen Show. Shameless plug. Where we could start, because I don't think we're that disagreement. I agree with you. The wealthiest, like the corporate interests, are ruling the world right now. You know, you might call that capitalism. We probably could explore what our definitions of that are, but I don't disagree with you there. The corporate interest, I mean, you just have to look at the pandemic and how that seemed to be just a giant enrichment of the big pharma, right? Yeah, and how they used, and so I think where we might disagree is on our diagnosis of where that comes from. My diagnosis would be, it's not the fact that these people are wealthy that gives them power. It's the fact that we have that society accepts as morally legitimate the use of force, and therefore we have these governments that have the mandate by the people to use force to organize society. And of course, then the wealthiest people are, in their own self-interest, going to use this legitimate power to enrich themselves at the rest of ours expense. So you can imagine someone owns a big company, and they know that every lobbying dollar they spend in DC, it gives them a 200% return on investment. Why? Because they can crush their competition. They can ensure that none of their workers starts a competing business because the regulatory hurdles are too high, thus saying those workers can never own the means of production by starting and by doing the things necessary, right? Which is saving some money, sacrificing the short term for building up some capital to build it. That all those things are against the worker and in favor of the corporate. So you have no disagreement there with me. I think we see the same sick system. Where we might find disagreement is exactly what the nature of that is. I say it's coercive force. You say it's maybe wealth in the hands of some certain people. Certainly, those two together don't mix well. I think we could probably agree on that. But I think that's a good springboard for our next conversation, where we can delve a little bit more into that, and maybe we could answer Ursula's question now. She's been waiting very patiently.
Sure. So yeah, no, I appreciate Tim. He is a magnanimous stand-up guy for having this discussion, and everybody listening to him can tell he's brilliant. So I definitely look forward to another show on your program. We have been going an hour, and I appreciate your time completely. But Ursula, yeah, we could spend another hour on this question, or we can summarize it quickly. I'm not sure how much time you have this morning.
I've got all the time in the world. We can keep going as long as you want.
Israel, Palestine. I mean, to me, it's pretty straightforward. Again, from a communist perspective, all the narratives that we're flooded with, the mainstream establishment narratives, are basically lies, and they're designed to benefit the interests of the ruling elite. So, there's the lie that it's just a complicated issue. It's just intrinsic Jews between Muslims, or it's, Jews and Arabs, and there's no solving it. It's just these people can't live together. Like all these kind of narratives to obfuscate the obvious. So the obvious, I'll very quickly go through the history. Because of centuries of persecution of people who identify as Jewish, primarily due to their religion, only not so much anymore, right? So most people that are identified as Jewish aren't religious. But back in 86 or 1896, it was, most Jews were Jewish. And they have experienced a lot of persecution. So the solution that they came up with was, we need to create a homeland for people who identify as Jews. And that's going to be the solution to this persecution of Jews by people who aren't Jews. So I kind of understand the impetus. The problem is they wanted to create this homeland, in a country that was only 5% Jewish for the past, 2,000 years. You had, a 5% Jewish majority. So in order for this homeland to be created, by necessity, you're going to have to engage in ethnic cleansing and land theft and terrorism, essentially terrorism, which, no libertarian is going to endorse that. So, and that's kind of what happened. The first Zionist conference was like in Basel, Switzerland in like 1896, and they ended up selecting Palestine as the place for the homeland. During World War One, the Western powers wanted to get, the international Jewish community on their side. And so Lord Balfour kind of wrote this thing, said, hey, we'll give you a homeland in Palestine once we win this war, but you guys need to support us in this war. And once it's done, we'll work on giving you a homeland. So that was the Balfour Declaration. That was like 1917 or something around that. It was actually before World War I had ended. So the Ottoman Empire hadn't been defeated. Britain did not have the mandate of Palestine. But eventually, World War I did end. Ottoman Empire was defeated. The Palestinian territory was given to Britain to govern. And until World War II, Britain was pretty good about allowing Jews from around the world to immigrate into Palestine against the wishes of the indigenous Palestinian people. So there was already these seeds of conflict were boiling. And then especially after World War II with the Holocaust, that really ramped up the amount of Jewish people who were immigrating to Palestine. And there's a lot of tensions because, the indigenous Arab community was not exactly being treated well by all this flood of Jewish immigrants. And they weren't happy with it. And they knew what was going on. They knew that the Jews were trying to make a homeland of, by, and for Jewish people, in the middle of their territory, and they weren't happy with it. So in the UN partition plan in 1948 was going to settle the issue, and it was going to give a majority of Palestine to, it was like a 30% minority. So Jews were 5% in 1900. By 1948, Jews were like 30% of the population, and they were going to give a majority of the land. The UN partition plan was going to give a majority of the land to a minority of the people, which of course isn't just or fair, but it's what the West wanted to do due to the Holocaust and things like that. But again, they weren't sacrificing anything. They were sacrificing the Palestinians. They weren't sacrificing, why not create it in Germany? Why not give the Jews a homeland in Germany? Why mess up? But anyway, so the partition plan was unfair. But the thing is the Israelis themselves, the Jewish people themselves that had immigrated there, they were not happy with a majority of the land. So they were given like 55% of the land under the UN partition plan, but that wasn't enough. And they were prepared to militarily push out and ethnically cleanse other areas of Palestine that weren't allotted to them under the UN partition plan. So at the end of the conflict, they accounted for about 67% of Palestine. So way more than they were going to be given, because they were better prepared militarily. They had the backing of the West. They had better military, better arms. So they won this struggle, and at the end of it, they had even more land. The Palestinians were pushed into the West Bank and Gaza, which the West Bank was controlled by Jordan, and then Gaza was controlled by Egypt. But it was like 23. Okay. So my numbers, it's been a while since I got over this. So ultimately, it was Gaza and the West Bank account for, I think, 22% of, historic Palestine. So that's 78. I think I said 67%. I meant to say 78%. So at the end of 48, Israel, the Israeli state accounted for 78% of historic Palestine, and the Palestinians were pushed on to just 22% of historic Palestine. So, and then in 1967, you had that war, and that's when Israel overthrew the Jordanian government in the West Bank and the Egyptian government in Gaza, and they actually started occupying 100% of historic Mandate Palestine. So in 1967, that was where Israel occupied the entirety of the state of Palestine. And so So, we see the Palestinians. I see it's obvious that the Palestinians are being victimized. They're victims of this idea that was, facilitated by Western imperialism to create a Jewish homeland in a country that's only 5% Jewish. And the West supported this endeavor, this colonial endeavor, because they saw that it would be in their interest. Israel would help them to, take all the wealth out of the Middle East, especially the oil. Israel's going to help them to destabilize the other countries in the area so that they never, develop sovereignty or are able to control their own resources, right? So it's like an extractive mechanism of neo imperialism or imperialism. So I have empathy for the Palestinians. On October 7th, obviously, Israel has not allowed them to create a state. They continue to build illegal settlements on the 22% of Palestine that's left. And, the Palestinians have legitimate grievances. And, in Gaza, it's literally like an open air concentration camp. People have no opportunities. Half the people are unemployed. Half the people are under 18. It's a miserable occupation forced on them, and it's like an open air concentration camp. So, as I don't condone terrorism, I don't condone the killing of innocent people, but like Nat Turner in the slave rebellion, where they butchered white families. Like, you don't condone it, but you understand it. You understand that this is naturally going to occur because humans are just human. And when they are, treated and mistreated and victimized and put in these awful situations, and they have a chance to lash out, that's going to happen in unfortunate ways. And so,
or put another way, when you violate libertarian principles, bad things happen.
I appreciate that contribution. I am wrapping up. I mean, I would just say the solution is that the idea that we ought to have, a homeland for one ethnicity or one religion or one cultural identity, and that it's not a state for all citizens despite your religion or ethnicity. That's the problem. So I think Israel is an apartheid state like South Africa. It needs to de-apartheid. I'm fine with one state. You can even call it Israel. Give everybody the same rights. Give Arabs the same rights as Jews, Palestinians the same rights as Muslims the same rights as Jews. And I don't have a problem with it. But so, yeah, I mean, one country from the river to the sea with universal, human rights. Now, that might give us a whole question about rights. But again, my perspective of rights is, it's the things that society agrees we need to abide by, and then they got to enforce that agreement, legally, and that takes taxation, and that takes not allowing people to say I don't want to participate. But okay, I just rambled, Tim, and I really did soapbox for a long time, and I apologize.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with. I don't think I disagree with most of what you said there. I look at that, and it's the same way. I'm like, okay, October 7th was horrific. It was barbaric. It was, it was a violation of. Yeah, you did things you didn't have the right to do, and likewise, I would say the response, to the degree where innocents are being killed, you don't have a right to kill innocents in response, right? And I see them operating from essentially the same place. Like, if I inhabit the mind of a Palestinian where I have no alternatives, where I have no hope, where like I got to do something to move the ball forward, and I'm going to use that to justify killing innocents. Well, that's the same thing Israel is doing right now. Like, if I inhabit the mind of an IDF soldier or a young man in Israel of military age, and I look at continual attacks on my countrymen and my people I love, by these people over there, I'll be like, well, I got to protect them. I got to do something to get my country into a better place, to make things safer, to make things better for my people. Yeah, I'm going to kill Hamas, even if it means taking out innocents. Fuck them. This is about survival. And as long as both sides inhabit that mindset, there's not a path forward. And until and that's why, in part, I think this conversation is so important, because what we're doing here is setting aside emotional triggers, and we're trying to find common ground and have a constructive dialogue. And it would be very difficult if someone from my clan, my family, murdered someone from your family. This conversation would be infinitely harder to have. And so that's where we're at with what's going on in Israel and Palestine. So, I mean, look, the path forward is going to be a difficult one because of how heightened emotions are. I mean, it reminds me a lot of where we were at just post 9/11 with North America just being consumed with feelings of vengeance, and we need to get back at people for what they've done to us. And then the chaos that created was not helpful at all. It made things a hell of a lot worse. So reacting out of this mindset and out of these understandably very highly charged emotions is not productive. And until people get past that, I think we're in trouble. And, I don't disagree with a lot of what you said. Again, that territory was under British control, if I recall, right? And it was Britain who held the power. So they planted a flag in this territory and said, we own all of this, even though there were people, whatever, 750,000 Palestinian or Arab people living in that territory, owning land that they had homesteaded, was rightfully theirs. Now we're going to use might is right and implement the greater good by using force, right? And that had terrible consequences. Had they been, applied principles that I value, things would emerge much differently. Then there's plenty of unowned land there that Jewish people could have homesteaded, occupied. They could have worked on. Sure, a one nation state that everyone had equal rights under the law would have been much preferable to what has emerged there. And so now unwinding all that, statism and violence and initiation of force and violation of property rights that has occurred is going to take some doing, and it's going to take an incredible mindset. And, I don't know what the answer is. I think certainly, I don't want to feed that. I don't want my tax dollars going to fund wars over there. They're going to have to figure that out as a people on their own, from my perspective. And maybe, in fact, us sending a steady stream of money over there is just encouraging more bloodshed in a lot of ways, because, if you think you can just steamroll over top of that people and get what you want, then you're going to do that if you have unlimited resources. If you don't have unlimited resources, well, now your mind opens up to more diplomatic and peaceful options. So, I look at those things. I don't lose any sleep over a terrorist getting killed, but I do lose sleep over innocent civilians getting killed who are getting caught up in this. And so I look at each act as by individuals. I try to judge it at an individual level rather than a collective level, because I don't think the state of Israel has rights or the state of Palestine has rights. I think that those individuals, they have a right to defend themselves, but they certainly don't have a right to kill innocent people. So anyways, I guess that's all I'll have to say on it. I don't have any great insights into how we can create peace, but I think we need to cut off the supply of blood money going over overseas.
That's an obvious start. Obvious start. But the reality is we don't control our government, and we don't have any say in our government, because our government is of, by, and for, entrenched wealthy elite interests.
Yes.
And it's not that different in Israel, but it's symbiotic.
Yeah.
And we've really empowered that state, and we've given them so much good PR that now the mass consciousness in this country, a lot of them are confused, and they find themselves, thinking, what's going on? Israel's the good guy. How can we not support Israel? We need to give them money. And then you have all these, Christian evangelicals are the biggest Zionists. They're like, hey, the Bible says if we're going to, enjoy God's favor as a nation, we have to support Israel. That's what the Bible says.
Right.
So it's not an easy task to undo.
And the Quran says certain things that makes it difficult for, Muslim people to engage in the type of mindset that might be necessary.
Holy site, and that's in Palestine. That's in Jerusalem. So religion on all sides makes it even more complicated. But it does definitely, enable the U.S. to continue, because the U.S. is the enabler, right? Like if the U.S. has a lot of leverage, we give them so much aid. If we said, you need to do this or we're not going to give you aid. I mean, the thing is, our system is so dysfunctional. If a politician tried to do the right thing and did that, he would be attacked and he'd be out. He wouldn't be popular. He might even get assassinated, Tim.
Well, I mean, look, Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein were trying to get off the central bank USD, right? And they ended up dead. So I don't think that was necessarily a coincidence. I mean, we portray this as Israel versus Palestine, but I think of things a little bit differently. Again, I look at individuals, and are they initiating force? Are they initiating violence? Are they killing innocents? Or are they defending themselves, or are they living peaceful lives? Those are the two sides here. People living peacefully, not initiating violence, and the people using violence. And so there are people on both sides that are the bad guys, and there are people on both sides in both territories that are the good guys. That's how I separate. I don't fall into the statist paradigm of saying Israel is one homogenous blob and Palestine is one homogenous blob. And, I think that leads to ethical confusion.
But Tim, I'm unhappy that you're ignoring the entire 100 years of context that I shared, because it's more than just individuals, some individuals living peacefully and some individuals not. Like, there's a context. Like the Palestinians are victims of expulsion.
Sure.
They're victims of ethnic cleansing. They're victims of the terrorism that led to that ethnic cleansing, and they're being victimized by not just the people that live there, but by the Western powers who supported that for decades. And so a solution has to address that injustice, accept the reality that injustice took place, and then deal with that injustice. And that's got to be part of the solution.
No, I agree with you. Yeah, those individuals were oppressed, right? They were kicked off their own property, and justice demands that where possible, land is restored to those property owners, and they are treated as equals in that territory, regardless of their ethnicity.
Tim, thank you so much. We're a minute and 22 in. I'm not getting any other questions from the audience. In fact, Ursula probably left after we did the question, but maybe she'll watch the replay. I do look forward to being on your program, and we can, we'll have some time to kind of percolate on our first discussion and this discussion, and see where we can really, go further, for our third discussion. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah,
I look forward to it too.
So let's end it here. So we don't have it scheduled yet, but we'll schedule it, and then everybody definitely follow the Tim Moen Show, and we'll continue this discussion within a few days, probably.
You betcha. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.